Hey everybody, Teching 101 here. Welcome back to the show. Hey, you guys want to prank old Emu-sama back there? You in for a little prank? Oh, okay. I have an idea. Just act natural, okay? Strumbumbly bum, I'm just walking over here in this general direction for no reason. Aha! You just got mustached, Emu-sama. That's the new prank. You got Whitebeard mustached. All right, so that's funny. There we go. Prank complete. Prank successful. Go ahead and leave some comments down below on how else we can prank Emu in 2026. That'll be the new running gag on the channel. All right. Well, anyway, today's video, how about a Whitebeard video? Everybody likes a good Whitebeard video, right? Yeah, we got to remember the man that stood tall so that Luffy could run or some shit. I don't know. When we met Polo Graham at God Valley, who is more than likely, I would say, 95% Marco's dad. I mean, we could find out that he isn't actually Marco's dad. We could find out that's his uncle or his great uncle, just like Zoro and Ushimaru were related. Or maybe that's not actually Marco's dad. Maybe that was Marco because of the Phoenix Fruit, which doesn't make any sense looking at the timelines. We already talked about that during the Phoenix Fruit discussion a little while ago. But meeting Polo Graham and asking Whitebeard to join his crew, right? That was at God Valley 38 years ago. We now have a pretty solid timeline of Whitebeard's life, and I kind of just wanted to make a video discussing that. From the time he was a little kid living on Sphinx Island, protecting that place against pirates, he basically formed a gang of all the kids on the island to go take up arms against the pirates, and then eventually he goes out to sea to become a pirate, and there's a few different crews that he was on. We see a flashback of him when he was like a teenager during Marineford, and then eventually he meets Rocks, and then he travels around with him a little bit, and then the Rocks crew gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually Shocky gets kidnapped. They all go to God Valley. God Valley occurs, and then after that, a man by the name of Polo Graham appears out of nowhere and is just basically like, "Hey, Edward Newgate, I'm a fan of yours. I like your style. Join my crew." And Whitebeard at first was like, "Screw off. I don't even know who you are," and just started walking away. But we know they ended up having some form of like collaboration, I guess. They worked together on a couple of YouTube videos, right? They had some collabs because 30 years ago, at Wano, when we, have Whitebeard arriving there, shipwrecking on the land of Curry, and then meeting Oden and everybody like that, we already have Whitebeard as the captain of the Whitebeard Pirates. He has his Jolly Roger. He has his captain coat. We have Marco and Vista and Jozu and Andre and Apoida and Whitey Bay and all these other members of the crew that some of them are still members during Marineford, and King Du was also there. Some of them, like Apoida, end up going off and forming their own crews and becoming allies of Whitebeard, right, that are still connected in that way. But, yeah, he has the Moby Dick, and he has all these things that we, associate with Whitebeard 30 years ago. Polo Graham is nowhere to be seen, yet Marco, Polo Graham's son, I guess his full name is Polo Marco, so Marco Polo, named after the adventurer, right? He's there, and he is an apprentice pirate at that time. So it's like, okay, what all happened then in that like 8-year period? Because that's not that much, like it is a long time. Like a lot of stuff can happen in that period, but like still it's kind of interesting, right? So starting off, right, he grew up on Sphinx Island. By the way, I mean to do a Geography is Everything on Sphinx Island, because we've already seen a lot of it, and it's one of the few islands I've really not done on Geography is Everything yet that we have a decent layout of. So I am going to be doing a Geography is Everything on Sphinx at some point this year. That's going to happen, right? So we see Whitebeard there as a kid, and it's sort of a situation where nobody really cared about the children on this island. It was just ravaged constantly, and so Whitebeard, he's wearing a shirt with the kanji for power on it, maybe striving for like, we need power in order to protect ourselves kind of thing. And he rallied a bunch of the other kids together to form essentially like a street gang and then fight themselves, like defend the island and protect themselves because nobody else was going to, okay? So he did that. And then eventually he goes out to sea. And during Marineford, we see a flashback of him without his mustache. He just has long, flowing golden locks. And there's just a random pirate crew he was part of. We don't know the name of the captain or anything like that, or the name of the crew. But he was out at sea, and apparently they had just made a big score. Like, they had gotten a bunch of gold and some treasure chests. And they were all like, hey, Newgate, come on over here. Look at all this treasure we got. And Whitebeard was just kind of like wistfully looking out over the side of the ship and just watching the sky, and didn't really seem to care about the treasure. And he's just like, nah, you guys enjoy. I didn't go out to sea to become a pirate for the treasure. And everybody's kind of making fun of him, you know what I mean? Like, what are you doing? Look at all this gold. It's like, well, what do you want? If you don't want gold, what do you want? What's the point of being a pirate? And Edward Newgate is just like, I went out to sea to find a family. All I want in life is just a family. And of course, all the other pirates on the crew are like, you sentimental jackass. We got all this gold. We are the unnamed pirates. We're gonna make it big. Yeah, so we don't know what happened to the unnamed pirates, but maybe they got wiped out by rocks. Maybe they immediately got wiped out by rocks after that scene, and then, Whitebeard was the only survivor, and then Rocks looks at him and just says, you need to grow a mustache. And then Whitebeard's just like, you know what? I was thinking about that. And then he grew a mustache, and that's where that connection began, right there, okay? So yes, Whitebeard's thing is always he just wanted to start a family, right? Because he didn't really have that growing up, except for maybe the other kids in the neighborhood that they, fought together. Maybe he viewed them all as his brothers and sisters, and that's kind of where it all started. And then he went out to sea to get away from Sphinx. Eventually would take a lot of the money that he raised from his treasure, and, he was a pirate, going out there and plundering and everything. And he would send his share of the loot back to Sphinx to kind of build it up to make it a safe haven, all right? So it wasn't, no longer a place where just pirates would ransack and everything. It was his territory, okay? Now, Marco is still living there, protecting it to this day, all right? And apparently, by the way, it's probably a good thing, because for like the, 1 or 2 weeks that Marco left to go to Wano and fight in the war, the Marines like instantly descended upon that place. So like Marco really does need to stay there at like all times, or else like people will descend upon that island and like try to take away everything that Pop's built up, all right? So, eventually, at one point, this becomes a period where we don't really know a lot about what happened, but eventually he probably finds his way to Hachinosu, the pirate paradise, ends up meeting Rocks, and the first time that Rocks arrives at Elbaf, he's accompanied by Shiki the Golden Lion, Buckingham Stussy, and Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, okay? It was the 4 of them that kind of made that initial visit to Elbaf something like 48 years ago. Rocks meets Harold 56 years ago at Reverie. That's when he encounters Emu and everything in the flower room. And then 8 years later, he goes to Elbaf to try to recruit Harold. And at that point, Whitebeard was already not really part of that. There wasn't a Rocks pirate crew yet at that point. That came about a little bit later when they officially decreed that, like, we are the Rocks pirates, and they started their home base on Hachinosu, blasted the eye holes out of the mountain, and kind of made that their base of operations. That was when the Rocks pirates officially started, and that was like 42 years ago or something. So this was just like a group of pirates that hung out with one another. You get the impression that Whitebeard, he always kind of said to Oden that, like, oh, I don't want you on my crew because you're a headstrong guy that wants to do things your own way. I had a crew all like that. That was what my last crew was all about. And he was referring to the Rocks pirates. I don't think Whitebeard disliked everybody on the Rocks crew, just maybe most of them, or maybe just his personality didn't vibe with a lot of the other ones, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, they were all trying to, like, benefit themselves, all right? There was really little cohesion there. But you get the impression Whitebeard did respect Rocks. He stayed behind to fight alongside him when Saturn was attacking. And he also looked at, like, Kaido maybe as his little brother. There were even those scenes where Kaido was kind of looking up to Rocks and Edward Newgate and was asking Whitebeard about, like, his devil fruit and everything. It's like, man, you have a really powerful devil fruit, Whitebeard. I wish I had a power like that. I want to eat a fruit at some point too. And then Whitebeard was like, well, son, let me tell you, whether or not you eat a devil fruit, that's a major choice, maybe the most important choice of every pirate's life. You got to weigh the options on what kind of power you want. I got a really badass one myself. Can't really complain. Strongest paramecia maybe out there. Top 5. Tier 0 paramecia fruit. I picked well, but you got to make sure, son. You got to make sure. So, like, Whitebeard was giving Kaido some advice. So, you got that impression. But a lot of the other ones, maybe Whitebeard didn't really care for all that much. And especially when Polo Graham was showing up out of nowhere, this complete stranger as far as Edward Newgate was concerned, and was like, hey, I like your style. I'm a fan of yours. Join my crew. Whitebeard was like, piss off. You know what I mean? Like, probably because he had a little bit of a sour taste in his mouth, especially after everything that went down at God Valley, Saturn and Emu taking over and everything, which, by the way, still a little curious about that. We had that epic scene, that cool full-page spread where Whitebeard and Roger and Garp, I think, was there too at that point, and Kaido and Big Mom, and like everybody was together, and Rocks all pooling their strength and attacking Emu at the same time, to just really just hammer home that physically demolishing Emu is not going to be enough. You know what I mean? Like, there has to be somewhere else to defeat him. It's just not going to work that way, right? And then there was that cool scene, and there was even the moment where Whitebeard was saying that, like, oh yeah, I'll stand with you, Rocks. I'll stick around with you. I'm not just going to abandon you here. And then immediately after that, Whitebeard goes off somewhere. Oh, Whitebeard goes off somewhere else. So, like, I'm not really sure how that went down, if it was just maybe the epicenter of the blast or something, because there was a big explosion of hockey, I think, shortly thereafter, if that, like, knocked Whitebeard back or something, but it was really weird. It was like, I will stand with you, Rocks. Epic combo attack. Bam! All right, I'm going to go off and do something else now, and so it was like Roger and Garp left to fight against the possessed Rocks at that point. I feel like Whitebeard could have had something to weigh in on that, but I guess not. I'm not really sure how that would go down. I guess we got to wait to see how the anime depicts that scene. So anyway, eventually, though, I think it's mainly just because he didn't have a ride out of there. Eventually Whitebeard was just like, hey, I'm not joining you, Polo Graham. I already had a pirate crew. We were all fighting most of the time. I really don't want another pirate crew. I don't even know who you are. I'm not joining your crew. And then it gets to the point where, like, God Valley is literally collapsing in on itself and there's no boat out of there. And there might have been a scene where Polo Graham was like, hey, I got a pirate ship right over here. My ship's docked right over there. Come on, Edward. Come on, Edward Newgate. And be like, okay, fine. I'll hop a ride on your ship, but I am not working for you. I am not joining your crew. So Edward Newgate joined his crew, and I guess they sail off. Now, what happened in the 8-year period for whatever happened to Polo Graham to happen to him, whether he died or whatever, it got sucked into the negative zone or some shit, and Whitebeard to get the Moby Dick, his flagship, and then have his entire crew joined up by the time we reach Wano. All right? So, because, Polo Graham was not inviting Whitebeard to be the captain of his crew. He was the captain of his crew. The Polo Pirates, I think they were called, right? So he's like, join my crew. So I could see Whitebeard reluctantly joining, becoming the first mate of the Polo Pirates, getting to know him, and then sort of forming a camaraderie with him, realizing that not all pirate crews are like Rox's crew or the rough and tumble crew that all come from Hachinosu. I also feel, given the fact that Rox was a big fan of the Davy back, there had to have been some of that involved too, of like why Whitebeard was hanging out with Rox. Maybe Rox challenged him to a Davy back. We might have had a really cool Rox versus Whitebeard boxing match, right? And Rox ended up winning, and and after 37 rounds of non-stop fisticuffs, boom! Rox dropped Edward Newgate for the title, and it's like, that would have been an awesome fight. But then eventually Whitebeard would have been like, oh, okay, you beat me fair and square. All right, I'll hang out with you. I'll be a member of your crew or whatever, right? So maybe there wasn't any of that with Polo Graham's crew. Maybe it was a different kind of pirate crew that Whitebeard had never really experienced before, and it was something closer to what he wanted, like an actual, family kind of thing. There might even have been some members like Vista and Jozu were apprentice pirates on Polo Graham's crew, something like that, right? And so if Polo Graham was Marco's father, Marco would have been like 7 at the time, okay, during the events of God Valley. And so maybe they were like the apprentice pirates on that ship, and then, after a while, Whitebeard and Polo Graham form like a brotherly, like, camaraderie, like drinking buddies kind of thing, and they were together for a number of years. And then something happened, the Marines attacked or the government attacked or just another really strong pirate crew attacked, and then Polo Graham ended up dying. He got killed. And so he sort of passed the title to Whitebeard and said, I hand my crew and my ship over to you, and, you can be the captain now. And so maybe some of the members we see at Wano were former members of Polo Graham's crew. Now, when it comes to Marco, because I know there is a popular theory, and I know I would love for this to be true too, the idea that, like, the Phoenix fruit just reincarnates into another person, you know what I mean? Like a clone of yourself, kind of. So, like, Polo Graham has the Phoenix powers. By the way, we had no idea. Devil fruit, if it was a devil fruit, if it was the Phoenix fruit, we didn't know that. He didn't display any of those abilities during God Valley. But if he did have the Phoenix fruit and then he died, he bursts into ash, and then, like, Marco, like a baby, emerges, and that's just Polo Graham just, like, reincarnated, right? That would have been a really cool, like, thematically going along with the mythology behind the Phoenix. That would be so sick. But according to the timelines, Marco was already born by the time of God Valley. He was like 7 years old, all right? So that doesn't make sense for Polo Graham to be reincarnated. Although what does make sense and what could happen is if Polo Graham did have the Phoenix fruit, which once again, we don't know if he did or not, but if he did, he dies, and then maybe the Phoenix fruit just immediately gets reincarnated from the ashes. Like, Polo Graham gives his last words to Whitebeard, just like, watch over the crew. Watch over my son. Ah! And then his whole body just emulates, just like ignites into flame. And then out of the ash, the pineapple of the Phoenix Zoan. And then Marco, Polo Graham's son, walks up and eats the fruit and receives the same power as his father. That could work. That could be cool. That we could still have that. And then Whitebeard decides to take over the ship and then basically looks at Marco as, like, essentially like his godson, kind of. You know what I mean? Like, Polo Graham might have just been like, hey, watch over my son for me. And then he dies, like, I trust you. And then Whitebeard is just like, okay. And so he always wanted a family, but now he might have been in a situation where he was essentially made the godfather of Marco. And he's like, okay, well, I have to make sure that he survives now. I have to make sure he makes it out of this. Okay, I will be the captain, right? And so he rebrands as the Whitebeard crew. They might have gotten the Moby Dick at some point then. And then at that point, they just begin to gather more members, and eventually they reach Wano, where they meet Oden for the first time, and then Toki. Oh, by the way, side note, side tangent involving Toki, just really quick, because I had to go back and watch these episodes when Whitebeard landed at Wano and everything, just, to double check everything. So I already knew this, but it's just, like, bears reiterating because it is kind of a big deal, right? Toki was never from Wano. She had never been to Wano until eventually she ended up in Wano because of traveling with Whitebeard's crew and Roger's crew, and eventually ended up in Wano, okay? She directly mentions she was born during the Void Century, and her parents were from Wano, and she wears Wano-like garb, and she's part of the Amatsuki family, which used to be a daimyo clan. It isn't anymore, but it used to be a daimyo clan, at least as far back as when Orochi's grandfather was alive and did his attempted, like, coup. At that point, there was the Amatsuki clan, and then something happened with them, and they're not around anymore, right? But yeah, it just bears repeating, because that is a big deal, that she has the time fruit, her last name is Amatsuki, and she dresses in Wano style, but she herself was not born in Wano. Her parents were from there. So it's something similar to, like, Kozaburo leaving Wano and then starting up Shimosuke Village, and then, like, Kozaburo was raised in, like, Wano traditions, but had never been there himself. That's really important, I feel, for what's going to happen later. And also, Toki really didn't have any idea of, like, Wano, like, what that place, like, where it was or what was even all about, right? It really implies that, like, after the events of the war, after the Void Century was maybe coming to a close, there were some people that were allied with Joy Boy, and they were from Wano, and they decided to get the hell out of there, and they left, went to another island, and then those were Toki's parents that had her, gave her the Toki no Mi, and were like, okay, you need to go into the future, and you need to find the land of Wano, and you need to figure out all this stuff, right? And maybe didn't give her that much information, and so that's her story, okay? But I just felt like, because I was watching those episodes, and I'm just like, oh yeah, Toki was never from Wano. She was never from that place. She just has connections to it through her parents, and that was it. Anywho, so Whitebeard meets Oden, And at first, they don't really get along. Oden was, of course, really a little bit clingy. He was just like, take me with you. And Whitebeard's like, nah. Now, eventually, Oden proved to him through being dragged in the chain, but also just how he would abandon the option to join the crew just to go off and save Toki. That was the thing that really spoke a little bit to Whitebeard there of like, okay, you will be my brother and we will go out to sea and we will go on a grand adventure and all that jazz, right? Absolutely. So then we have the scenes there where they're hanging out and they go to Fishman Island, and then eventually Whitebeard's crew fights against Roger's crew, and then eventually Oden goes over to Roger, and then, you know, we have a couple of more scenes with Whitebeard after that. There are the scenes where Marco and Ace and Teach and Whitebeard were all talking about, like, Wano and maybe how we should go maybe out back to there and stop Kaido and everything, which is still a point of contention. You know, the way that they talked about it was essentially like, well, we didn't even know that Oden died until several years after it happened because of the limited information that leaves that place. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, I suppose. It does bring up the question of, like, you never went back to check on Oden after he left, I guess. Maybe you didn't have to or whatever. I mean, remember also, Whitebeard's crew, the way that it was set up, a lot of people left to go form their own crews and start up their own journeys and their own adventures, like Epoida and Whitey Bay and Andre. They all left and joined and made their own crews, and they were allies at that point, right? So maybe Whitebeard viewed the same thing about Oden at first, like he went off and maybe he heard from Roger that, like, oh yeah, he had returned to Wano. It's like, oh, okay, you know, but, you know, by the time he found out about what was going on a few years later, Oden was already dead, and it was a question of, like, do we go after Wano and try to liberate it in Oden's memory, because obviously nothing's bringing Oden back, but we could, you know, save the island. This would mean directly confronting Kaido. It would be a Yonko crew versus a Yonko crew. Kaido at that point was definitely in his prime, and Whitebeard at this point would have also been past his prime a little bit. And they do bring up that it would have resulted in a lot of civilian casualties along the way. Now, the counter to that is, well, a lot of civilian casualties happened in the intermediate time period. You know what I mean? It's just like, since the moment that Ace brought this up several years ago, is like, we should go to Wano and help out Yamato and free the place from Kaido, and be like, well, people are going to die. It's like, yo, people died in the intermediate time period. People are dying every day in that country from the horrible conditions. So, you know, that is a concern, but also it's just like, yeah, but nothing's going to change unless Kaido is ousted. So, you know, even during the, I keep knocking this, I had to move the microphone back to the stand because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see Emu back there. It was the whole, like, with this thing. Yeah, so I keep bumping into it. But anyway, so, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think they should have risked it and, like, formed, like Whitebeard made the call to all of his allies at that point and been like, we march on Wano and we're going to take out Kaido once and for all? Which side would have won? I don't know, and especially if anybody else wouldn't have gotten involved in that, because anytime two Yonkos clash, the world government and the Cypher Pole and everybody starts looking and paying attention to that, right? Because it's like, oh, two Yonkos getting together. I mean, best case scenario, they wipe each other out and we don't have to worry about them anymore. Worst case scenario, like with Big Mom and Kaido, they form a fucking alliance, you know what I mean? So, you know, who's to say that, like, if Whitebeard decided to, you know what, Ace, you're right, let's avenge Oden's memory. In fact, I might even do a what if about that. I feel like there's more, like, intricacies to look into this. And it's like, what if Whitebeard would have went after Kaido and then would have lost, and so Whitebeard would have died earlier? And then what would have happened at Marineford, and, like, the crew disbanded earlier? Like, that's a whole thing. I might actually make a whole thing about that. Like, what if Whitebeard would have tried to defeat Kaido in Oden's memory, or try to, like, march on Wano at Ace's behest? We'll talk about that maybe another day. But yeah, and so yeah, that I remember leading up to Marineford. It was mentioned by a lot of people that Whitebeard had not made a lot of big waves in the world recently. He wasn't really like front page news because he was getting a little older, and he wasn't just making as big power plays as like the other Yonko were at this point. Kaido and Big Mom were making more influences in the world, and it's I think mostly just because Whitebeard doesn't care about the One Piece. Whitebeard didn't care about having all this territory. He would put places under his care and his charge that he wanted to be protected, like Fishman Island and Sphinx, for example. But Whitebeard was never the kind of guy to just be like, I want all of this for myself, right? Like, he just wasn't greedy. He didn't have that in him, all right? He was a pirate, but he didn't want all of the same stuff that, like, Kaido wanted to form, like, a pirate nation. Like, he didn't want that, right? So not a lot of people, like, we're talking about, and even some people, other than the old-timers leading up to Marineford, were like, yeah, this Whitebeard guy, I mean, I heard he's strong, but he hasn't done anything in, like, forever. Isn't he might just be like an old fossil. He might be in the retirement home or whatever. And then all the old people were just like, you never underestimate Whitebeard now. He'll kick your ass. He could start an earthquake and destroy the entire planet, I'd be like, bullshit. I'd be like, I don't know about that. He might be able to, So, that was Whitebeard's legacy leading up to it. And then we have his meeting with Shanks, where they interact, and now that has all new context because Shanks knew that Ace was essentially his little brother, and he was trying to look out for him and everything like that. Do you think, I mean, I guess not, because we had that whole conversation. It was all on screen with Shanks talking to Whitebeard. Shanks didn't bring up anything about, like, oh, by the way, God's Knights. Oh, by the way, Covenant Seals. Although in that conversation, Whitebeard did bring up that, like, every time I look at your face, Shanks, that scar that bastard gave me hurts all the more. And we used to maybe think it was Garling, because Garling is Shanks' dad, and so maybe during God Valley, Garling fought Whitebeard and gave him a scar. No, apparently Garling and Whitebeard didn't even really interact all that much on God Valley, right? So it's most likely Shamrock. It's most likely Shamrock that eventually would end up fighting against Whitebeard at some point, probably within, like, the last decade or so before he died, gave Whitebeard a pretty nasty scar, and now that Shanks is showing up, he knows he's a different guy, but he's just like, you're bastard of a twin brother. I remember that guy. Cut me down. It hurt, And so that also means that Shamrock managed to fight against Whitebeard without any maybe serious injuries, although we don't know because Shamrock always dresses very fancy, so who knows? Maybe Shamrock takes off his shirt and we see this like giant bicento scar caused by Whitebeard during his fight. It's all splintered out from the shockwaves, like he got struck by lightning. You ever see the lightning scars? People that get struck by lightning, it like branches out like a spider web. Kind of the same thing with Whitebeard with his bicento. Yeah, does it make sense? No, but it would look cool as shit. So maybe Shamrock didn't make it out of that unscathed. We just haven't seen it, right? Okay. But anyway, yeah. Let me know down below on just like some like interesting moments in Whitebeard's past and what would have happened if he would have tried to liberate Wano and the whole thing with Polo Graham and how that would have went. Or maybe Whitebeard joined Polo Graham's crew and he was only on that crew for a couple of... Actually, okay. Other way you could do it. He was on Polo Graham's crew for a little while. And Polo Graham's crew, maybe aside from Marco, had nobody like Vista or Jozu or anybody like that. After maybe a year or two, Polo Graham dies. But in that brief time, Whitebeard kind of got the new perspective of like, this is what it means to lead a pirate crew. Like, because remember back then, Whitebeard was in his younger years. He was not the exact same man as he was, we see at Marineford, right? In his Twilight Years, right? And so maybe he needed somebody like Polo Graham's crew to kind of show him, like, this is what being a crew is all about. This is what being a family is all about. This is what Nakama are all about. And Whitebeard was like, you got a point. And then he dies, and he's like, no! And then that's the reason he started the crew the way that he did. He always wanted a family, but Polo Graham's maybe sacrifice. Maybe it was a thing where Whitebeard was going to die, but Polo Graham jumped in front of the attack or something and saved his life. And just like, look after my son. You can be a great pirate captain. He dies, and then Whitebeard's like, I will be. All right? In your memory. Something like that. I don't know. Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, everybody. This will be Teching 101 signing out. Oh, no. The mustache failed. Emu is too powerful. He rejected the stash.